Welcome back to CannaWeek, brought to you by New Frontier Data, where we deliver the week's top headlines in cannabis and hear experts weigh in on the impact these stories are having on the industry. I'm your host, Heather Wickline. Today, we have a great show lined up for you today, and it's actually the last show of 2020. So we thought it'd be no better way to look back at this historic year, and no better person to do it with than a longtime friend and investor of New Frontier Data. He is the founder and managing partner of Merida Capital Group. Please welcome back Mitch Baruchowitz. Mitch, thanks so much for spending time with us today.
Such an absolute pleasure to be here. I couldn't be more excited.
Awesome. And our next guest needs no introduction. He is our in-house expert and leads our fabulous research team. Please welcome back Chief Knowledge Officer of New Frontier Data, Mr. John Kagia.
Delighted to be back, Heather. Thank you for having us, and I'm very, very excited for this one.
Me too. Let's go.
Well, we got to end the year with a bang, guys, so let's do this. So our source today is actually going to come from our weekly Cannabis newsletter. It is 2020 Vision, reviewing major trends for the legal cannabis industry. And we have identified the most significant developments leading into 2021. And we're going to start on the international scene. The UN is the most significant change to their cannabis policy of the last 60 years, voted to reschedule cannabis, opening doors to recognizing the medicinal and therapeutic potential of the plant. And meanwhile, the European Commission rejected a proposal to regulate CBD as a narcotic, protecting a booming CBD industry. So, Mitch, do these votes indicate a change in the global attitudes towards cannabis and minor cannabinoids?
I definitely think it does. And I actually think that one of the major themes for us, and I think it's something I'm so excited to hear John's opinion on, because you can only have so many discussions, in real life, and we haven't been able to see each other for quite some time. But the last time John and I were in an airport together, we had a very deep discussion on kind of what did we expect at the end of 20, early 21, like when were things going to really change? And I think we're really starting to see the beginning of that. And, let me separate what is important from a signaling perspective from the substance. So when I saw the UN change this designation, I tweeted, it reminded me of Joseph Stalin's response to everyone saying that the Pope, was excited to be part of the peace treaty. And he said, oh, how many divisions did he contribute to the victory? The UN hasn't been helpful on the global scene at all. And we know that the World Health Organization, there was a lot of expectation that the World Health Organization at some point in, I think going back to 18, right, John, was going to make some change. So this is a huge signaling event for a variety of reasons. And I'm sure we're going to talk about South Dakota later, because I'm going to find a way, John, to get you talking about South Dakota. But signaling is crucial in cannabis, right? It because of normalization. So I think of it as a crucial signaling event. From a substance perspective, yes, it will make it easier for other international markets to potentially change their laws, saying, look at the validation from the UN. Look at the fact that this is no longer seen as a quote unquote drug per se. We're now talking a consumer good, potentially a medical good. And, anyone who's listened to me speak over the last year has heard me say that the medical vertical might be the most underappreciated element of the changes coming in cannabis, that when it's normalized, you will see a true medical vertical. So with that, John, what I would pose to you is, I think it is as broad signaling. Obviously, you're much more in tune with international markets, even though I do have some investments overseas. In your opinion, is it signaling or substance? Which is bigger?
It is signaling, but I don't think you could have a more consequential signaling event on the global landscape. So there's a few reasons why I think this is such a consequential move. First, the UN vote was based on a recommendation made by the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization is the world's leading global health authority. They made the recommendation that cannabis should be rescheduled. First, because the harms that other drugs included in Schedule 4, which is the most restrictive class of drugs and regulated substances in our society, the World Health Organization statement was basically that cannabis had no business being included in the same categorization as drugs like heroin. So the harms associated with cannabis that have been so central to the propaganda around cannabis, the World Health Organization finally came around and said, that's just not right. Second, there was a subtext there around the way prohibition enforcement has been promulgated around the world, where generally it is poor and marginalized communities that have borne the brunt of prohibition enforcement. And while this, I don't think, was an overt kind of position adopted by the WHO or in the UN vote, it definitely was a major subtext, because when you look at how prevalent cannabis use is, particularly in developed societies, and you look at who's being prosecuted and criminalized within those societies, there's an inequity there that I think is kind of the world is waking up to. It is not exclusive to the United States, where you remain 4 times more likely to be arrested if you're Black than if you're white. This is a global phenomenon based on the disparities in other societies. And then
John,
third,
so let me just before because I want to break your flow so I can see if you can stay on number 3, but the enforcement angle, I just want to tell you, is something that I'm going to let you finish your points. And then it's something that I think is the most insightful thing, because it's something people don't think about, is if you can't enforce it in a rational way, then what's the point of prohibition anyway? Yep. So that's such an amazing point that people don't even think about. But I'm sorry. Yeah, keep going for number 3. I'm taking notes, by the way. I don't take notes when a lot of people speak, but when you do, I'm taking them.
So third is the WHO was endorsing the idea that there needs to be a lot more cannabis research. And the acknowledgement that cannabis, based on the research done to date, has shown phenomenal therapeutic potential. The WHO is basically saying this plant has shown phenomenal promise, but there needs to be a much more robust research regimen that advances our both understanding of and integration of cannabis into our pharmacopoeia, into our therapeutic portfolio. And this, while it doesn't do this overnight, it creates that opening. And here, when we talk about signaling, one of the ways I think this vote is so important is that it gives countries that have been thinking about this but acutely concerned either about the position of the UN or the position of the United States, and so have reserved their changes to cannabis policy because they didn't want to kind of err on the wrong side of either of those stakeholders. This now gives them cover to make changes that some of the more progressive countries have already made. And I think that's going to be really important in how we see cannabis evolve on a global basis over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, you saw Colombia started taking concrete steps to potentially adult use. And I think the other thing, just to highlight, I think a lot of people, especially people who are just kind of looking at cannabis as this broad industry and really aren't digging in, don't really understand that it takes years to build statewide programs, federal programs. Obviously the US, I think on the last time you and I spoke, on a CannaWeek, we talked about how federalism is such a US quirk, and that the reason it's worth watching how the US does things is because like the UN and Germany. So Germany obviously resoundingly voted down in adult use. They have a robust medical program, but it is highly pharmaceutical. And I don't think people really gauge the amount of illegal activity in foreign countries, and that this signaling, if it even brings 20% of the international market into the legal market, that transition we've talked about, I don't know, I've been, screaming from the rooftops for the last year about that transition. If you get, some illegal activity to move into a legal framework, the whatever you guys projected as your 2021, 22, 23, 24, your US, your international, those numbers explode.
Absolutely. And this opens the door to do that. And there's an important distinction you've made there, Mitch, which I think is really important to hammer home. And this comes back to this idea of signaling versus substance. The UN vote, I think, makes it okay to think about doing this. But as we've seen across so many different countries around the world, it's actually really difficult to get from the idea of legalization into a robust, well-regulated, fully operational, regulated market. And so it is going to take a little time to get to the point where we're talking about a true global cannabis economy. And I want to align expectations that this isn't going to be a flip of a switch. But I think, one, it opens the tent a lot wider to more countries to think about this. And then two, I think it accelerates the pace at which some of the countries which might have been dragging their feet will get there.
And it does highlight the thing, and I know, Heather, as the moderator, you get to jump in here, but the only thing I think is, and it's the area that I'm most interested in talking about, because I think it is the largest singular opportunity mindset. It permeates the entire cannabis industry, which is normalization, right? Yeah. The UN just takes another brick out of the mythos of illegality. It takes another, brick out of that foundation of legacy prohibition, legacy myths of the harms of cannabis. The Reefer Madness posters in 1934, 1938. I actually posted 2 of those, where the devil is looking over people's shoulders as they're smoking the devil's lettuce. And I think the UN just basically said to a lot of international markets, here's a discussion you need to have. And you said it most is research. You're not going to get medical research. A bifurcated rule set may get you to places where you're going to have, federal laws, and especially in the United States, we're kind of used to that duplicity of federal state interaction. There's not a lot of countries in the world that have laws that contravene UN mandate, the WHO mandate. So this is, it is more than substance. It's more than signaling in some ways, but you highlighted that it really does drive that. The more this gets normalized, the more a regulator doesn't look like a quack for suggesting it in a place like Germany. And it also matters, parliamentary procedure matters. The US, we're lucky in some ways that we can pass it in these little laboratories and move the ball along in a way that Germany can't, or, even Israel, which is the home, the birth of literally medical cannabis. They don't even have an adult use law yet. And it's the most progressive place in cannabis in the world.
So what would you say are the implications for these votes for the cannabis industry, like writ large?
The international votes or the
international vote?
I think it's just when you take the bricks out of the foundation of illegality, it's shocking. And I think John said this, and he said this to me once privately, but we say in public what we say in private to each other. I think John highlighted for me is how fast these signaling devices become argumentative points in favor of new laws, whether it's amazing how quickly people go from agnostic to advocates based on what the signaling is like. And that's why I still, say that what South Dakota did, what Mississippi did, a state where alcohol was illegal till 1966, which is Mississippi is the home of medical cannabis for the FDA, for NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which is who controls all of the medical research cannabis. I think it's amazing that they resoundingly passed a medical law. They resoundingly approved a ballot measure, in a red state. Obviously, it was a presidential year, but South Dakota, John, I want to talk about it. They skipped the normalizing step of medical. And I think it is my thesis that it says more about the future of laws in the United States and globally than any other distinct step that we've seen in the regulatory framework of cannabis, except for the first one, Colorado, that legalized adult use. I do not believe there's anything more important on the regulatory side or ballot measure side other than since from Colorado's adult use to South Dakota's skipping the medical step. They passed a medical law as well. They passed the medical law and they're being challenged on a constitutional quirk, whether or not the ballot measure was valid. But I truly believe that South Dakota reflects the UN, which reflects the fact that when you talk about taxes, when governors talk about taxes, whether it's the Illinois, that we didn't do layoffs, Colorado school budget, the health budget of Washington, when these governors talk about what it does for their budgets, when people talk about that there haven't been a spike in youth usage, all of the data is unequivocal. And then people look at stocks that are trading and every day on CNBC, I think what you're getting is a general broad public consensus on the banality, if we can use that word, around cannabis legalization. Shocking to say, because a year ago, there's no way we're having this discussion, but the fact that someone skipped a medical, John, you and I spoke about this privately, the fact that someone skipped a medical step is normalization. We've been talking about this for 5 years now, my friend. So you can lay out what you think about that, but I think the road to normalization is moving much faster than we predicted.
John, what do you think?
I completely agree with all of that. And in fact, I'd like to just kind of take a step back and put this year in context. At the risk of sounding hyperbolic, I actually think 2020 could go down as the most consequential year in the history of cannabis, at least thus far. And I agree. Kind of on Mitch's theme of signaling, the convergence of hugely consequential developments in the industry or impacting the industry this year. So you take the UN vote one, and it was a narrow vote, 27 to 25. But those 27 countries now give you direction of which countries are now, at least within that governing body, most likely to be receptive to the year of progress. The fact that the WHO and the UN had delayed this vote for 2.5, nearly 3 years, and it's happened at the tail end of 2020, was a huge step on the global market. In 2020, you also had everything from Lebanon, Ghana, Rwanda, Malawi, really the far reaches of the globe, at least if you're sitting in Washington, past legalization, past medical use measures. Hugely important, because those are not the first places on the planet which you would pick as places to be leading the charge on medical cannabis legalization. So it shows you how even in societies that have been very traditional, very conservative historically, there's a mind shift that has happened in terms of receptivity to medical cannabis as an economic engine and as a public health / medical kind of wellness enhancement benefit to their healthcare systems. And then to Mitch's point, not only within the US 2020 election did you have a clean sweep of state initiatives, and the fact that all of these initiatives passed comfortably, including South Dakota's adult use measure at 53%. But the fact that South Dakota, about as deep a red a state as you can get, ran two initiatives, a medical use and an adult use measure, which is the first time that has ever been done. The fact that they both passed and passed at a comfortable margin, and the fact that they passed even when the state officials, the governor, the majority in the state's legislature were urging voters to vote against these measures. The voters still passed them resoundingly, is an indication of how significant this disconnect has become between public support, public endorsement of this issue, and where some of the political class remain. And then maybe a final point just about the US vote, is because this was arguably the highest participation kind of vote in our lifetimes, it shows that when you get everybody to vote, cannabis can pass comfortably, even in the most conservative parts of the country. Pennsylvania's lieutenant governor made a really interesting comment saying, if you're a Democratic governor and you're on the right of South Dakota on any issue, then you're doing something wrong. And I think this really challenges the states that have been slow walking this because they're not sure how the electorate might play out. This finally puts to bed the idea that there are places in the US where cannabis cannot be approved, because if you can get two measures through in South Dakota, if you can get adult use passed in South Dakota without a regimen in place first, then there's really nowhere else in the country where you would expect to find a great level of resistance. And any one of these would have been a consequential development. Yeah. But having them all happen, and largely all happen in the last 2 quarters of 2020, I think has been a phenomenal tailwind for the cannabis industry going to 2021.
No, it's such an amazing point about 2020 being consequential. You really helped me with what I wrote about COVID, how COVID we thought changed the landscape. And, I think there's one point I want to make about what you just said, which is so huge that I want to bring it out because it's such a brilliant insight. But first, let's just run through quickly, like in COVID, and jump in here if I'm missing anything. But what we spoke about is the fact that there's professional regulators in most states that have laws now. So you're getting a much more receptive, like, oh, COVID hit. What do we need to do to protect this consumer good, this medical good? That's a huge thing, right? The fact that tax budgets getting killed, everyone needs tax. The fact that the consumer is looking to shift to the legal market because of what we spoke about, everything but price. And now you see scale, price comes down. You made this point to me, the price is going to come down. That is an inevitability. And then lastly, the fact that COVID brought safety to the fore because of the vape crisis in 19 in a way where people said, what is available on the legal market? And regulators going, you know what, it makes sense. This is happening either way. But you made one point, which I think, on South Dakota, which I think is so crucial that it really can't be underscored enough. And it can't be overestimated how important this is, which is people had a side-by-side measure in South Dakota where they could say, you know what, let's just deal with people who are sick and who want to deal with medical. Let's just say yes to that. That's enough. That is a bridge plenty far enough for a state that voted 64-36 against in 2010, against a medical bill, a pure medical bill. They could have said, the people of South Dakota could have said, let's just create some access and see how it goes, and we'll revisit this. And, it does show that there is this binary now where voters simply, all of this, John, I really do believe it has to be based on this deeper normalization, this destigmatization that just comes from the discussions every day around money, economics, they look at Colorado, they look at other adult use laws. There's just enough empirical data to just say, this isn't the harm we were led to believe, because they could have stopped at medical. And the truth is, people, they could have easily said, check on medical, check against adult use. The fact that South Dakota checked both means that we are seeing such a fundamental shift. States like Texas, right? You're going to see states like Texas, you're going to see the data come out that states like Texas are wildly, look, the support for medical we know is a fait accompli. That's gone. That ship has sailed. The UN showed it. That's why they voted for medical. Every country is going to be thinking about medical, at least the 27, the 27 that don't of the 27 in the UN. But we know that medical was always seen. When I think back to my origins in the space in 13 and 14, how many times I would talk to advocates who would say something like, the problem with it, if you create a good medical program, you're going to get in the way of adult use. Yep. And we had this fight. When me and my partners were doing such a great job in Connecticut, people would say to us, that's a problem because adult use is going to be tough to pass in a state where there's a functioning medical, where the people who need it are getting it. And I think that people in South Dakota said, not a problem. We're going to approve both. I personally, John, was shocked that the adult use passed. When I saw the numbers for medical, I was shocked that adult use passed because I was simply shocked that people would say, one rule is not enough, that adult use is enough. I know you were probably surprised as well. I was shocked personally.
I was, and maybe just kind of dovetailing on that, because I don't disagree that South Dakota was the most consequential state by a wide margin, and arguably potentially the most consequential state ballot initiative that we've had in the US to date. But I actually think Arizona was also critically important in this cycle, because the fact that Arizona's adult use initiative failed at 48% in 4 years ago, in 2016, and passed at 60% this year means it shows you just how quickly the pendulum has swung in 4 years. Right. And why is that important? New Zealand just tried to vote for adult use, and that measure failed at 46%, a little over 46%. But using Arizona analog, and I think when you look at the demographics and profile of New Zealand, there's a lot of parallels you could draw with some of the social and cultural changes that are happening in both markets. Right. It's eminently kind of believable to think that with a little better mobilization and a little more time to allow for demographic shifts, New Zealand is going to comfortably pass this measure in the next few years. And that's going to set the dominoes rolling, not just in the Asia-Pac region, but it starts to make cannabis feel less like a North American and partly European phenomenon and truly like a global initiative. So
and creates that inevitability, John, right? That inevitability, it's interesting to think of a law where you have this, it's like you're sitting in front of a regulator and you're saying, hey, like if you're, someone's talking to you foreign, I know you talk to like government people all over the world. Someone says to you, John, I'm not sure we're over the hump. And you're like, well, there's 10 billion of illegal sales happening in your country right now. Mm-hmm. It's hard for that person to look around now and see a lot of support for that illegality, that prohibition. Like that guy doesn't have a great argument for you. Now, 4 years ago, he may have said, look, John, you have a wonderful accent. You're a handsome guy. I like what you're saying. Now, all the facts, all of the data it's like, you can basically say, you can choose to make this safer. You can choose, it's not about legalization. It's about taxing and regulating. And
interestingly, for the countries that have been resistant to even having this conversation, it was one thing when you could point to a few states in the US, maybe Canada, maybe Germany, and say, those countries look nothing like us. Right. But if you're saying in the same breath, look at Canada, look at Germany, look at Malawi, look at Lesotho, look at Australia, the ability to say that this is limited to a specific type of sociocultural profile, a specific profile of economic development, just can completely goes out the window. So one of the things I think that 2020 has done is create a much richer diversity of kind of use cases or application cases of where cannabis progress is happening at a breakneck pace. And that means that if we're talking about the contagion effect, this idea that cannabis becomes most likely to pass in countries where residents of that country see their neighbors or people who look like them passing initiatives. There's a lot more places in the world where people are going to be looking at their next door neighbors and saying, hey, if it's legal there, why is it not legal here? And that's going to kind of stimulate more dominoes to fall.
Yeah, and let me just finish the thought also. I mean, like, since you basically sucked up all the great oxygen on that point, I think it's also really important that there's companies that are profitable in the US who have shown how you can graduate to a governance-focused, highly structured, not spending a lot of SG&A. Like these companies like the Curaleafs, Cresco's, GTI, Truly have shown how when you scale up, bring prices down, you're going to see adoption in the legal market so much faster. The US is truly setting a model for success that people say, wow, when prices come down, illegal market transition goes faster, taxing and regulating works better, regulators are more, in tune, there's better tax dollars. But I think it really does come down to who are the operators? You've taken all the incentives out of the illegal market. And I think that's when you think of where 2020 started on the heels of the vape prices, like you said, it is the most consequential, easily the most consequential year, because now you have the maturity of companies to go along with the maturity of regulatory bodies, with the maturity of data, with the maturity. And you know what? That's why I keep saying to people when they say, Mitch, what are you really excited about from an investment perspective in 21? I say the medical side, because that's the one, if you get research and you can start to, do more cannabinoid-based research and it's legal and sanctioned in the US, it's hyperdrive, right? It's Spaceballs, it's ludicrous speed, right? You press the ludicrous speed button, doctors are gonna get involved, there's gonna be more education, there's gonna be more global, and it's like the biggest crowdsource. Which US university that does botanical research isn't going to be doing cannabis research if there's a federal law like the MORE Act where they can do research on a university? I mean, I just think of all those pieces coming together. And the truth is, New Frontier deserves a tremendous amount of credit for providing a lot of information. I know the UN vote. When I saw the vote, I know there's 8 or 9 countries that you guys work with. There's no way they were just guessing. They were looking at the econometric data, and I'm not going to out you on it, but I know there's a few countries you speak to on that. Like I said, John, you're not foreign to those countries and to you guys working with those companies. And for me, maybe I'll close my 2020 by saying, it's been such a joy to work with the New Frontier team. When I first made this investment, it was always about getting the best data, the best information to drive Merida's process. And to be honest, everything I could have ever hoped for New Frontier when I invested is proven out by the amount of work and stewardship you guys have done for the industry. That's why I sponsored your most recent research report. And to be honest, it's been an incredibly gratifying ride. And I'm so excited for the future of New Frontier. I'm excited for the future of Merida, the industry in general. I think 2020 is closing out in an amazing fashion, given what we've been through as a society. And I don't think we would be in certain places without the work of you, the New Frontier team, Giada, Gary, Heather, the whole New Frontier team. And the fact that I've had some little piece in helping you guys get to where you are might be, I'm going to look back and think it was one of the greatest successes of my career. And I couldn't be more proud and thankful for you guys as an industry participant.
My gosh, thank you. Well, I do want to just
cover?
touch on a few other trends that we had discussed and actually part of this report that you had sponsored. We
Sure.
did want to touch on what you touched on a little bit of before on the COVID-19 and consumer behavior and all the changes. I know our survey found that 42% of cannabis consumers claim that they had increased their consumption since the beginning of 2020, which seems not shocking. And every virtual legal market in the United States led to cannabis being declared essential. So it was a big, huge year for that as well. So I really wanted to just kind of get your opinion, Mitch, on this essential designation and the way everybody's looking at the cannabis industry differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think the normalization is I hate to use that word or overuse it, but when you think of something that's illegal, what is the goal of a regulator, or what is the goal of a society when integrating something that's been illegal for so long and has all of this legacy? You have when you start in cannabis in 2009, 2010, the headwind, it was like being one of those wind tunnels, right? It's just like you're barely moving and you have to work your hardest. Then you start to, the wind gets a little lower and maybe now you're just on a really windy street. And now the wind's behind you and you've got a 50, foot sail and it's a schooner in the 1850s. And I think all of this activity on the consumer is saying, we want legal, safe, high quality cannabis and we want access. And so what did COVID do, or what did regulatory do? They made delivery in Colorado, where it's been, illegal forever. They made, it's not easy to integrate delivery laws and delivery rules because there's things that go around. There's safety that people want. So delivery, curbside, these are fundamental access points that the illegal consumer has gotten used to. And that's why it's just, it's just building on itself.
Genie back in the bottle after.
Yeah, there's just, you can't unring that bell. That bell is ringing and it continues to ring. There's no point. And here's the great thing. And John, I mean, feel free to disabuse me of a notion, because I love when we have these, you can take me to task on this, but I don't think anyone's even trying to stop the bell from ringing anymore.
Yep.
Well, John,
That's the biggest change.
Sorry, good.
Completely agree with that. And, it's really interesting because we're now at the end of 2020. If you had said that if you had told us at the beginning of 2020 that the world was about to experience an acute pulmonary related crisis, given what we had lived through in 2019 with Valley, the acute lung injury caused by the black market vapes, and the idea that we're going to be suffering now another major thing that would have people reconsidering how they consume. I might have actually been pretty gloomy about the outlook for the industry and what this might do to the way we perform, particularly when you talk about this being a pulmonary condition and a major kind of catastrophic disruption to both social and economic activity. The essential designation, I think, was, at the risk of being hyperbolic, a godsend for this industry.
That's two hyperbolic risks in one day, John. You are really excited. For you, this is like the unfettered optimism of you're like Nassim Taleb telling us there's no more black swans. Everyone's just white. It's like, I'm a little nervous now. Like you and Nouriel Roubini used to be in the same category. Now it's like, woo, a lot of optimism coming from the New Frontier side.
This is not, I don't think I'm being Pollyannish here. This is after thinking very, very deeply about the convergence of things that we've seen this year. But I'm actually more bullish about the cannabis industry than I have been in a long time, just because of the number of positive signals across the spectrum of our society. So critically on this essential designation, you can't undo that. So at a time that the rest of the economy was shut down, the preponderance of states where cannabis is regulated declared those businesses essential. Whatever the federal government does moving forward, you cannot undo that designation or the gains that the industry has made in that period. Second, the clearly intense concern that has been raised about how the illegal market operates, and consumers saying, I may like my guy, but I don't know where he's been and I don't know where this product is coming from. I would prefer I got it from a clean kind of medically.
Is that your New York street accent right there?
It was a terrible one, wasn't it?
I like my drug dealer. But John, one point there though is the form factors as when COVID, you said it, the confluence of factors, right at a time when the illegal market, really the form factors are shifting to a form factor that the illegal market doesn't do a good job on.
Absolutely.
Vapes, edibles, these are things that you need industrial kitchens, which the legal market does far, far better.
And just on that shift, part of the thing that what our latest consumer survey just revealed is that for the first time, consumers have said that edibles are their favorite product form, even though they're consuming flower more often. So they may be consuming edibles less frequently than flower, but the innovation that has happened in the edibles, and in the edibles category specifically, I think is such that the convergence of food science and research innovation around efficacy, around consistency of product, around kind of homogeneity, all of that is converging for a really elevated product experience. And that's only going to be kind of dramatically accelerated as the edibles category in particular starts to build scale. So one of the things we're going to be looking for in 2021 and beyond is not only a dramatic expansion of the portfolio of types of edibles products we see in the market, but just a lot more innovation in terms of the types of things that you can consume that have cannabis that compete with, particularly in speed of onset time, with combustibles. And that is going to be game changing for the future cannabis consumer.
But there is one little secret that is driving those form factors as well, which is states like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, where, I'm one of the 4 operators, they are extract-driven markets. So when you have those things, there's consumers have limited options on the flower side. But I think, it feels to me, and we've done a little bit of econometric surveying ourselves, what we've seen is when we talk to people, a lot of people look at edibles as like it's a weekend and it's a longer session per se, whereas it might be like, hey, I'm going to puff before I go to sleep, or I'm going. So I do think you're starting to see the specificity of consumption to the quote unquote environment that people are in. And I think that's interesting because that feels to me like I may have a glass of wine with dinner, but if I'm out with, with people and we're looking at like it's an event where, someone's going to drink cocktails, or I think you're seeing that differentiation. And I think it's something that it just, again, shows the normalization of cannabis as a consumer good rather than this, idiosyncratic quote unquote drug that people are like, sneaking in the corner, which that's just completely going away.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, we are almost out of time. So I did wanted to end on one final question for you both. And it's going to be, well, I guess it's a two-part question, but it is going to be a tough one. But what, out of this whole year of 2020, what surprised you the most for this industry? And what are you most excited about going into 2021?
John, I'm going to let you take that one first.
I was hoping you would be a good
We're
guest.
going to try to keep this
No,
under.
because he likes to play. John, if me and John were playing tennis, he'd be a counterpuncher. So, I'm going to make him serve and volley on this one.
Okay.
So what surprised me the most? I think it is the totality of all of the positive developments that have converged, particularly toward the end of the year. The central designation at the beginning of the year, ending with not only a clean sweep at the state level, and we haven't even talked about the fact that we have a Democrat about to be sworn into the White House, and a Democrat who has affirmed support for descheduling. We've never been here before as an American society. And the implications for that moving forward are only kind of going to accelerate the transition that we're seeing within the American market. So what has surprised me the most? Just how many positive developments across the board, both domestically and internationally, we have seen in this industry, and particularly given how hard 2018 and 2019 were. If you had said that in 2020, it would have been difficult to believe that we would have seen this many wins coming out of 2020. And what am I most looking forward to for 2021? Perhaps the biggest thing will be what happens first on January 3rd with the Georgia election, which will determine the outcome of which party maintains control of Congress. And then immediately after that, the Biden administration's outlook for federal US cannabis policy reform. We don't want to get in over our skis here, but there's going to be a very, very robust national conversation that the US is about to have about the status of cannabis in our society. And given, again, all of the tailwinds coming out of 2020, I think you are starting to see some cracks in some of the old coalitions that have rejected cannabis starting to form. The fact that Matt Gaetz, who is arguably one of Trump's most loyal supporters, is a Republican out of Florida, who has been, kind of lockstep with the Republican Party on most critical issues, was one of a handful of Republicans that voted for the MORE Act 2 weeks ago. And he said, basically, this issue is done. He was urging his Republican colleagues to embrace cannabis because in the American electorate, according to him, this is a settled issue. I think is just the kind of reflection of how some of the dominoes are starting to tip in terms of people who have opposed legalization in the past. And really looking forward to seeing how this debate evolves in 2021.
Well, John, so I'm gonna trump you a little bit and just say that nothing you just said to me was surprising about. So I wouldn't say the most surprising thing is all of the confluence, because I think we've been talking about it for years, and I think we predicted a lot of that 19, maybe 20 would be a year where we started to see that maturity level of the industry. So I actually don't think that's the most surprising. I think it's incredible. I mean, if surprising and feeling a sense of joy and wonderment are the same thing, then I would agree. I would argue that the most surprising thing is the aggression of the voter and of regulatory bodies in rejecting the progression, meaning like rejecting the stop of cannabis's progression. So you have the legislature of Virginia saying to Ralph Northam, we're not going to delay a report on adult use till 2021. We're going to get it out in November of 20. This is a state that didn't even have medical a year ago, right? So that has surprised me the most, is how much regulatory bodies and voters in just a few short years decided 2020 was the year where cannabis prohibition writ large as an issue that can be debated is no longer debated anymore. As Matt Gaetz, as you said with Matt Gaetz, that shocked me, is how quickly, John, this became a non-issue and South Dakota being the perfect example of this, is how quickly the shift, we've been talking about normalization and pharmaceuticalization, medicalization, and the destigmatization, those four things. And look how quickly all of those things came together in 20. Shocking. And you're right. I mean, look, it is surprising that all the confluence, but the truth is I am most shocked by how much voters and consensus has absolutely shifted, where it was a seesaw that might have been seen as equal. It is now legality is sitting on the ground, and illegality and prohibition are way up in the air now. It is 1,000 pounds and 2 pounds. And it wasn't like
so
that.
I think we're in violent agreement. And I would just say to that point, Mitch, I mean, just in terms of surprise, and Virginia is a perfect example because I lived in Virginia for 30 years.
Right.
If you'd have told me that, in 2020, Virginia would both decriminalize cannabis, making possession of up to an ounce a $25 offense, and this is a state that was notorious for throwing the book at folks who got intercepted, and then within a couple of months be talking about transitioning to adult use, I'd never believed it. There's no chance. So when I talk about surprise, it's at that kind of two-tier level of, yes, there's macro forces, but even in places where you would not have expected, Ghana and Rwanda,
the micro,
to get examples. It's the pace of which it has happened and the reach of these developments, I think, has been truly extraordinary.
Right. We saw the green shoots. Those plants got big quickly. Mm-hmm. And then, let me make that same point in South Dakota. South Dakota CBD is still largely illegal. The most draconian laws on cannabis just skipped the most normalizing steps. So that to me is the most surprising elemental on a micro level. What I'm looking for in 21 is what I've been saying for the last 2 years. I think it's never been more relevant, which is it doesn't matter what the federal government does. The inevitability of cannabis's move is happening on a state level. And regardless of what happens at a federal level, it can only accelerate things at this point. There is nothing that can happen at the federal level that will anyway stop the revenue growth, the progressive growth, the adoption, consumer adoption, all these things from happening in 21 and beyond. And what I'm looking for in some ways is, I think it's an interesting debate at the federal level, just because I think there's so many things that fit both parties' agendas in terms of state-federal split, that federalism that makes US so strong on moving regulations forward. I think there's a lot of Republicans who make cannabis a state-based issue, make abortion, guns, whatever it is, a state-based issue. I think there's a lot of people on both sides that would agree from an overarching theme that is a way to think of these issues that have more of a local flavor. And what I'm interested to see most is watching companies mature. And you know what? My prediction in 21, which not many people are saying, is that you're going to see the first US companies really reach out to foreign shores and make some inroads in European and other markets, because the US operators, in my opinion, are by far the best operators in the world. Not even close. They've been swimming upstream for years. They're the Michael Phelps of swimmers at this point. They didn't have the capital that the Canadian companies had. They're sharp. They don't use spend SG. If you're a large MSO at this point, you've gotten efficient with your operations, and I think that can benefit overseas markets. So that's really my prediction. I don't think anyone's saying that you're going to see US companies overseas. You're hearing it here first.
Well, thank you for putting that on CannaWeek. I love it. Well, thank you both so much for your time. And thank you to our listeners for joining us here at CannaWeek. Be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. And again, if you'd like to sign up for our Cannabis newsletter, we have a free weekly newsletter that goes out on every Monday. Go to newfrontierdata.com/newsletter-signups. I'm your host, Heather Wickline, and I will see you in 2021.